Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the latest MRC webinar. Today, we're going to be discussing climate change and its effect on future longevity. There are differing opinions on climate change in terms of its impact, the effectiveness of the actions being taken or not being taken, and there's considerable uncertainty in how to interpret the ramifications of climate change itself and the indirect effects. But the potential range of outcomes is such that it represents a material risk to actuarial clients. Moreover, there has been an increased regulatory pressure to ensure that there is sufficient consideration of climate change risks in determining the long-term assumptions used by insurers. It's a highly relevant topic for us as a profession, and delighted to have joined me to provide illumination on this topic, Jill Jamieson. Jill is the head of UK pensions at Club Vita. She's responsible for the strategy of services that Club Vita offer to the UK pensions market to help pension funds understand, quantify, and manage longevity risk. Jill is a pensions actuary, and prior to joining Club Vita, gained more than a decade of experience advising trustees and sponsors of UK defined benefit pension funds. And in 2021, Jill won Actuarial Post's Star of the Future Award. So well done, Jill. Maynard Kuona, who is a principal advisor within KPMG's UK Life Actuarial team and acts as the technical lead for longevity research in the team. Maynard participates in KPMG's climate change research and has notably contributed to developing KPMG's modelling methods and tools for evaluating the potential effects of climate change on mortality and longevity in the UK. Maynard also has a wider interest and experience in economic capital modelling, and particularly in applying actuarial and wider techniques in modelling longer-term risks, including climate change risks. And last but not least, Sandy Trust, who is a past chair of the Actuaries Sustainability Board and sits on the International Actuarial Association's Climate Change and Sustainability Committee. He is the lead author of a series of collaborative research reports which bring together science and risk, seeking to improve policymaker level risk management. The latest report, Planetary Solvency, Finding Our Balance with Nature, explores how actuarial techniques can help society manage climate change and other risks. Sandy's personal mission is to help reconnect finance, the economy to nature and the biosphere to deliver a future worth living in. He works with investors and advises a number of regulator and policymaker groups on these topics. So, as is typical in a lot of the challenges facing actuaries in general, but longevity actuaries in particular, we need to draw upon areas of multidiscipline and bring those together. So I'm delighted to have such a breadth of panel to be able to discuss these topics with you today. So welcome, guys. Hope you're well. So I'm going to get started, but first, just to make everyone aware, there will be, if you've got any questions, we're going to have a discussion first, but please post them in the chat, and there'll be time at the end for me to read out some of them, all of them. We'll see how we go, and post these to the panelists. So please add them as you go along. We will cover them at the end. So let me start with our first question. And this is probably to Sandy. I'll probably start with you if that's okay. What are the key challenges in understanding climate change? So just an easy one there to begin with.
Yeah, just an easy one. Thank you. Well, I think it's. Can I share my screen? Am I allowed to do that?
Please.
Tech. A new platform. It doesn't. There we go. So as if by magic, everybody, stand by. I'm going to show you a picture of your home from the outside. Is that working?
It's coming. Yes, here we go. Got it.
There we go. Your home from the outside. Isn't it beautiful? But this is really complicated. That's the first difficulty. The energy comes in from the sun. That energy hits our planet. Energy reflected out. The ocean absorbs some energy. Greenhouse gases trapped on. So it's really, really complicated. Lots of feedback loops. Lots of complexity. Lots of things we didn't know about and can continue to discover. It's practically challenging to model all that. Plus, so fiendishly complicated models. As you talked about at the opening, stuff could go both ways. It can but it could conceivably get colder in the winter. So how do you try and capture that uncertainty? I won't go through this. That risk uncertainty box on the bottom right. So you've got tipping points. These are these big kind of non-linear systems, and this red box, which is stunning. Climate sensitivity, Earth may be much more sensitive to greenhouse gases than we think. Oh, that doesn't sound great, does it? So how much more sensitive and how wrong could we got this? So this on the left-hand side, this probability function is a climate sensitivity, and that likely range, that's what we've based carbon budgets and warming projections on. There's a lot of evidence to suggest it's actually up in the low likelihood, high warming range as stuff has happened. So what does that mean? If you look on the right-hand side, it's already the darker the colour, the higher the temperature. It means in that top high ECS box. And if you look at the kind of first kind of red colour, that's over 2 degrees warming. For all the rows of different emission scenarios with high sensitivity, we're over 2 degrees well before 2040. So that's nuts, because last I heard we were trying to do net zero to keep to 1.5 degrees by 2050. And this is actual global temperatures plotted for the large odds. If you look at the red circle, temperatures over the last couple of years have been consistently above 1.5 degrees. That doesn't really technically hit 1.5 degrees, which is a long-term average. That's the red line. So if we keep going, or officially reach the long-term average of 1.5 degrees before 2030, well, hang on a minute, we're trying to do that by 2050. What's going on? So it's this high sensitivity accelerated, and that's the trajectory on, and that's obviously driving. And topically, given the tragic use of Jamaica and the Caribbean, that's driving very significant increase in extreme weather events and ship losses, and also things like insurance withdrawal. I'll just take you to the bottom right of this slide, a climate-driven food system shock. So we're not really, well, not since World War II in Britain have we really had to think seriously about food system shocks and shortages. We're working with other biofood researchers, with academics who are very seriously looking at shocks to the UK food system imminently, and the potential for civil unrest. So I think definitely not the mortality guide. All this is pointing to very high uncertainty and high range of potential outputs and disruption to not just temperatures and the economy, but actually some of the basics we take for granted, like nutritious food. And just to finish, I will finish on a positive note. These are the tipping points. I'm sure you're aware of these. So this is this big bits of the Earth system which we could tip, and once they tip, like tipping pints of water, milk, coffee, red wine, once you've tipped it over, it's pretty difficult to tip it back. And the reason these are particularly concerning is either they accelerate climate change, forest fires, permafrost, melting these greenhouse gases, or they accelerate the impacts. And just to pick for the Atlantic circulation, 15% slowdown in the 1950s, that massive transfer of heat from the tropics to northwest Europe gives us our climate. That is slowing down. Now, that doesn't have to completely stop for our climate to really significantly change. And what I mean by significant change, I mean, we keep the high temperatures in summer plus 40, we might go down to minus 20 in winter. So a radical increase in temperature change. The other impact that would have is to significantly reduce crop growing capability in the northern hemisphere by the order of about 50%. So there are really very significant risk, very significant uncertainty, wide range of potential impacts. But I did say I was going to finish with a message. We still have very high agency. The future is not in our next paper. We'll talk about that agency. There's an awful lot we can and should do. I hope we will do so that we don't get those kind of tail risk outcomes.
Cool. Thanks, Andy. Really good introduction there. So can I follow up to Jill and sort of focus on what are the key challenges for actuaries, giving the increasing pressure on both insurers and pension funds to account for these risks?
Yeah, sure. So I think the main challenge for actuaries comes with the fact that climate change will unfold over many decades without historical precedent. So we as actuaries have limited amounts of reliable data to use in our modelling and to help guide our understanding of the future, particularly in relation to the indirect impacts of climate change, which are even more complex and far-reaching than the direct impacts of climate change. And if I was to pick an example, say the behavioural changes that might occur across society off the back of climate change, we're thinking about what people choose to eat, the transport they choose to take, where they choose to live, and how all of those things then might impact their lifestyle, their health, and ultimately their longevity. So there's a lot for actuaries to think about, even just in relation to that one small behavioural change example, with very limited amounts of objective data, and it's all very, very complex. And from a pension fund perspective, each pension fund is unique and will be impacted in different ways based on the characteristics of their membership and the duration of their scheme's liabilities. So there's not really a one-size-fits-all approach to this, which I think creates quite a big challenge for actuaries.
Absolutely. So given the complexity, how can we make the problem of understanding climate change and making about the assumptions about the future more manageable? So, Maynard, do you want to try and tackle how we can take all this complexity and make it easier for us and for our stakeholders to deal with?
Yes, I'll give it a go. So I think the starting point is, as actuaries, we already have frameworks which are a good starting point to just thinking about some of these long-term risks and long-term trends. And I think many people probably on this call or in the webinar probably work in things like longevity assumptions. So we already have to make assumptions about long-run expectations of mortality rates. And this frequently already includes consideration of the likely drivers for some of those changes. So in a sense, actuaries need to expand these frameworks that we've already built to address, I suppose, most of the risks that we sort of we're expecting in the short and medium term, and just expand these frameworks to actually start to incorporate climate change impacts. And this is something that we're seeing, I think, as Sacha mentioned, the regulators sort of start to push on a little bit more. Actuaries, as well as other longevity risk practitioners, probably also need to develop their understanding of human susceptibility to some of the relevant sort of physical risks, which affect mortality and morbidity directly. So things like temperature, rain, air quality. These are some of the things that a lot of the climate models that are out there, where some much cleverer people than I am have sort of developed these significant climate models, which Sandy sort of touched on earlier in the call. And we can use some of those outputs in addition to some other information that we have sort of more currently to help us model what we think those impacts are going to be. For example, those direct temperature impacts. And in some cases, maybe the appropriate response for actuaries is to defer to the expertise of some of those other experts, where maybe that's something that's outside the range for current expertise, or maybe something that actuaries might not necessarily be expected to sort of develop into. So it might be thinking about how potential economic growth stagnation affects healthcare spending and so on. You might want to bring healthcare economists sort of come up and maybe help actuaries with their thinking around how these will sort of turn out or turn out in the future.
Jill, can I bring you in? Anything to sort of add to what Maynard said?
Yeah, of course. I completely agree with Maynard's point on bringing in other experts. I think we absolutely have to do that. For me personally, I think that scenario modelling is one of the most powerful tools that we have to make sense of uncertainty, especially regarding climate change and its impact on longevity. I think by exploring the impacts of possible future events, actuaries can stress test their assumptions and understand how different scenarios might play out over time. And with scenario modelling, the goal is really to combine subjective insights with objective data to create a sort of comprehensive view of potential plausible future outcomes. And the scenario narratives that we craft can help them bring the risks to life for non-experts and also reveal potential events that traditional stochastic models might miss, given they rely on historical data. So I think scenario modelling makes the problem much more manageable. And at Club Vita, to help our clients, we've developed 3 scenarios to highlight the potential impact of climate change on longevity. And perhaps I can just touch on them very briefly. They are sustained stagnation, turbulent times, and rapid response. And for each of those, we've crafted narratives and then projected life expectancies under each of those scenarios and considered the variations that might occur by socioeconomic group. And we've developed these scenarios to help clients or stress test their own funding strategies in relation to climate-related longevity risk and try and make the problem of climate change that bit more manageable.
So Sandy, as someone who's sort of more of an expert on the climate change and the longevity side, what further advice would you sort of provide, to sort of improve on what Maynard and Jill were talking about, or did that all sound totally reasonable?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give Maynard or Jill much advice. Actually, I worked with Maynard many years ago, and he frequently bamboozled me with his kind of technical expertise. So I think yes, scenarios. What could happen? Lots of things could happen. Be careful with climate scenarios. They don't necessarily represent tail scenarios. I think we have to, as ever, look carefully at limitations, assumptions, underpinning scenarios, what's realistic, do we buy it? Cross-disciplinary work is critical. The physiological society has been a lot of climate and key kind of work with professions. I think it's medics, physiological society. This is really an area for collaboration. I think the other thing is it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. This is an area where, unsurprisingly, in financial services, we said, let's quantify it. Let's precisely calculate stuff to be for all significant here. And it's sadly spurious nonsense. So we need to, I think this is where the kind of professionally skeptical actuarial mindset can be really, really powerful. We're used to assumptions, we're used to data quality, we're used to model validation. These are all really important skills.
Very good. So let's try and dive into some of the detail. And some of the specifics. So I'm going to sort of fire off 2 or 3 questions to first Maynard, then Jill, so and let you sort of cherry pick where you want. So, what would you consider the relative importance of direct and indirect effects? Will these be positive or negative for longevity? And can longevity be considered in isolation?
Okay, so I think there's a lot that's already known or understood about the impact of weather or climate on human mortality and morbidity, in particular as we discuss in our article in the latest longevity bulletin. So there's a bit of a plug for the latest longevity bulletin.
I was going to get to that later.
Yeah. So temperature in particular is known to have a significant effect on mortality, and that's probably one of the areas that has been really well studied and understood, with various papers published in various journals exploring that link between temperature and mortality. And additionally, sort of different climate pathways may also produce other differences in things like air quality outcomes. There are probably other sort of weather outcomes, rainfall, and so on, which can be expected to exacerbate or ameliorate sort of different risks to human mortality and morbidity. However, some of those impacts are likely to be a bit more uncertain than, for example, temperature, in particular because if you look at something like air quality, maybe there's a much stronger local sort of drivers compared to something like temperature, i.e. you can ban diesel cars sort of locally, you might close some local fossil fuel generation plants like near large population centers. And I think those can be quite important. So those drivers can be quite important in terms of mortality, those direct things that we can model. We've got some really good data, as Jill sort of mentioned, having data that and you can use that to incorporate the areas that actually don't know those climate projections to sort of produce some of those impacts. Now, the importance of those effects will vary from country to country or from region to region. So in most of like Europe, for example, we tend to have much colder weather than, say, tropically, and therefore the balance between what happens when temperatures rise in general, we might have a different balance in terms of the risk. So you might have lower number of sort of cold deaths, higher numbers of sort of warm deaths, potentially. And again, there are a lot of uncertainties around this, which Sandy might have sort of mentioned as well when he talked about some of the uncertainties and the tipping points that he sort of mentioned. So in the scenarios that we've modeled, and again, this is sort of based on climate projections that are probably now, maybe we're looking at 3 or 4 years old. They were, in the UK, for example, there were relatively sort of small and offsetting impacts for the positive and negative drivers when we looked at temperature. However, I would also note that other studies have produced contradictory outcomes, which speaks to the uncertainty inherent in climate modeling, that we are sort of really in the realm of things that are not certain, they're not quite as sort of straightforward to model, and there's going to be a lot of arguments being made back and forth. And indeed, uncertainty around certain tipping points like this Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, AMOC, which includes components such as the Gulf Stream, may mean that some of those temporary effects that we might have anticipated to be positive, say in Europe, could actually turn out to be negative, as Sandy sort of mentioned. So if we lose that Gulf Stream, for example, or if maybe you don't lose it, but the effects are sort of somewhat sort of reduced, then we might have colder winters, and therefore you could have the double whammy of colder winters, more winter deaths, hotter summers, more summer deaths, which again may mean some of the temperature effects that have been measured in some projections are significantly understated. But thinking more widely and globally, I would note that some of the impacts again may be more obviously one-sided in warmer countries where maybe they might only expect to get more heat during the summer, and the cold deaths are maybe not quite as material. So in terms of whether these will be positive or negative for longevity, I think it depends where you are. It depends on what happens with some of those tipping points, which again does speak to the uncertainty around sort of modeling climate impacts in the long term in general.
Jill, what are your thoughts on this?
See, maybe I can step in there. So yeah, I do think the direct effects are important and will be more important in some countries than others, that Maynard's just said. For example, we're seeing hurricanes in Jamaica at the moment. Unfortunately, and for countries like Jamaica, direct effects will be extremely important. For those of us in the UK, where the impact of temperature change and other direct effects are kind of less important than other countries in the world, I think it's the indirect effects that we're going to be most worried about, and they can really lead to significantly different projections in health, life expectancy, and the economy. So I thought I could share some of the indirect impacts that Club Vita have considered as part of our scenarios. And the scenarios that we've released are UK specific at the moment, but we've looked at the spread of infectious diseases. So climate change could expand the reach of insect-borne diseases and increase the frequency of pandemics and zoonotic diseases. We've looked at the availability of food and water. We know that climate change affects how food can grow and how much clean water is available. And this puts pressure on ecosystems, communities, and economies. Looked at impacts on human health, so the air pollution and extreme heat. We know they can worsen cardiovascular conditions, respiratory diseases. And I think what's important is that the longevity impact will vary by scenario and by socioeconomic group. The effects of climate change are not expected to be evenly distributed across society. And it's the youngest generation that are going to be exposed to the greatest impacts, positive or negative. And if I can maybe pick up on your point, Sacha, about whether longevity should be considered in isolation. No, I don't think it should be considered in isolation, because some of those positive longevity outcomes could coincide with positive or negative asset outcomes. And at Club Vita, we have mapped our scenarios to the widely known climate pathways that Maynard mentioned that are typically used when stress testing assets. So that should help our clients consider the impact of climate change on both assets and liabilities in a joined up way.
Very good. So obviously one of the contexts, we've moved a long way. I think there's been a lot of talk about climate change probably since before I was born. We won't get into how long that's been. And we've moved from, oh, it's not happening, you're totally off your rockers, to perhaps a general acceptance, let's put it as limited as that this is a real phenomenon. But ultimately, whenever we're sort of constructing models or providing advice, the ears have to be open to hear what might be an unpalatable truth for many business leaders. So I suppose one of the key questions in terms of constructing our advice is understanding, how well it's understood. So if I can start with Sandy, do you think climate change and the potential effects are adequately appreciated by the public and the government? And, how does that understanding affect the required action to mitigate or transition to the effects of climate change?
Only easy questions today. So I'm going to introduce Lucifer at this point. So what do I mean by Lucifer? Well, it's a mnemonic. You have to a risk management mnemonic. Lucifer, loss. You have to believe loss can be significant. You have to understand the risk, care about the risk, care about the risk. You have to think it's quite imminent if you're going to take action. You have to focus your priorities on effective action. Effective action. You have to look at what you're going to do to make a difference. And last but not least, you have to think the action is rational, economically and politically. So when you look at all these conditions, they're not consistently met. People do not broadly think food shortages are likely, food inflation is happening. People all understand tipping points, the economic analysis being deeply flawed on climate change, both underestimating upside and underestimating downside risk. So categorically, no, we have a bit of a feeling things get quite bumpy, but in my view, we're not where we need to be.
And if I can sort of switch to sort of a sort of real world sort of longevity, not for what you're saying wasn't real world, that sounded like an awful way of phrasing, but in terms of Maynard and Kuona, Maynard and Jill, in terms of talking to potential clients, how are you finding the receptiveness of your clients to sort of hearing about this problem, and how much are they engaging with the reality that you're, or potential realities that you're presenting?
Yeah, I'm happy to share my experience of working with pension funds, if that'd be helpful. I'd say some schemes are much more engaged with climate change than others. Those that are engaged tend to be schemes that are planning to run on, so they want to fully understand the risk that they're running. Or it can be down to the nature of the employer. So if the employer or the sector that they're in is going to be deeply impacted by climate change, then there will have been business strategy discussions around that, and the pension fund tends to form part of that discussion. It's maybe an employer-led discussion with the pension fund and trustees being brought in at that point. For those that are less engaged, I tend to find that it's either because their attention is focused on shorter term issues that they feel they need to prioritise. So it's not that they don't believe in climate change or want to take action, it's that their attention is drawn to these shorter term issues. But the other key one is that a lot of schemes, their long term objective is to buy out with an insurer. So ultimately, the risk will be passed on to an insurer, and in some cases, in the very near future. So they're not choosing to prioritise this, given they'll be passing on that risk.
Okay, I can probably add a little bit there in terms of maybe much more from a life insurance perspective, that I think over the last years, I think climate reporting has sort of taken on increasing importance to sort of life insurers in general. And we can sort of see this again through the PRA. I think some of the PRA sort of climate scenarios that they've asked companies to model as well. So this is something that companies are beginning to engage with a lot more. The key challenge, as I've seen it, has come from just, again, it sort of speaks to actuaries, our skill set and the availability, the expertise that we have is sort of fairly limited in the climate space, and there's a lot of dependence on other professionals and maybe other companies providing those scenarios, that modeling, not just what's happening to the climate, but what's happening to the economies, and actually having all of this sort of be credible and understood and accepted is probably the key challenge. And if you look across the piece, I think it's quite difficult for, I think while a lot of the people that I've engaged with, that I've dealt with, and a lot of the companies that you sort of see trying to sort of think about climate change, I think there's an increasing understanding and acceptance that climate change is happening, it will have impacts, but what the scale of those impacts are is always going to be, currently is just an open question. It's like, as Sandy said, maybe we're underestimating the upsides, underestimating the downsides. And I think that then makes it very challenging for companies to maybe take specific actions to try and manage some of these risks, because when you've got both upside and downside risks, how do you deal with this? And also, I think just this is a fairly sort of nascent field in terms of, it's only in the last sort of decade or so that things have really come to the point where maybe people are starting to think about sort of reporting this to the public and giving the public that information to helpfully help the public make investment decisions, make decisions about where to put their money, where to buy their insurance policy from. Um, there's a lot that actuaries need to understand about not just what happens when it gets a bit warm, it gets a bit colder, what happens to migration patterns, how does that impact sort of what governments are spending their money on versus sort of in maybe a different scenario. So I think all of these things are things that we sort of see companies sort of think about and talk about, and the solution isn't there yet in terms of, I think it's really about the journey to understand what the risks are, how you can begin to address the risks as you go forward. And I think that's probably where most of the benefit is, rather than maybe getting the final answer. And that might maybe not come so easily with actuaries, as we're sort of quite used to getting an answer and putting an answer down in paper and saying, here's the answer, make of that what you will. But actually, this is probably about getting people to understand the risk, getting people to manage the risk, and be willing to change your views as more information comes out, as well as your understanding increases. And I think that's probably where the challenge is, and that's where maybe companies can make the best use of some of this information, some of this thinking.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, yeah, I use the term fortunately in the loosest possible sense, but COVID itself provided a fantastic example of breaking some of the traditional mindsets and having to live through uncertainty and how to manage that and how to present it. I think that works quite well as an analogy. A lot of the sort of cobweb of interactions there are not directly relevant. In comparison, in some ways, COVID was easier, but at least provides a sort of an analogy they can latch onto of, well, something's going to happen. You need to be thinking about this. You know, the it'll be all right on the night probably isn't going to work as a strategy. We've touched on some of the variations, and I'm sort of going to bring sort of Jill and Maynard back in to sort of just sort of pick up anything that has where we haven't covered in terms of, how you think the UK, and even on this one, probably Sandy, in terms of the global versus the UK, thinking about it from a longevity point of view, industry variation in terms of how it will affect different people as they approach retirement, socioeconomic variation or age or cohort variation. I know we've covered some of these points earlier on, but if there's anything that you want to sort of highlight as key variations that people should be thinking about from a modelling point of view, can you offer any thoughts on this?
Yeah, happy to share my views to kick us off if that's helpful.
Brilliant.
For me, one of the most striking observations from the analysis that we carried out was the generational impact of climate change. And based on our projections, if we were to think about cohort life expectancies from age 65, baby boomers might expect to see a 3-year swing in life expectancy based on which Club Vita scenario you've chosen, whereas the youngest generation could experience a 13-year swing in life expectancy. So it's that youngest generation that are exposed to the greatest impact. I said earlier, whether that's positive or negative, but that was quite a striking outcome that from our paper.
And I'll probably just add to that. And again, sort of when we've looked at this, and a lot of our research has really focused on some of those physical risks, temperature-related risks, we could see some differences or some consistent differences between what would happen at younger ages versus older ages. So some of these things, like if it gets extremely hot, gets extremely cold, this has been shown, and I think consistently have a much larger impact on older individuals, for example. And this will then sort of challenge companies where maybe demographics are moving in such a way that we're going to have an older population in the future, and what is then the response to trying to deal with this, because it's probably not going to be acceptable to let all the old people sort of just start dying off a little bit quicker. So these are some of the things that we then have to deal with. And again, those impacts will vary by country, because other countries will have different sensitivities, will have sort of different risk profiles from a climate perspective. And again, the socioeconomic variation that Jill mentioned, I think that is there again, that poorer people or people who are less able to sort of mitigate their own circumstances, heat their homes, cool them down on a really hot summer day, they might see more of these impacts. And then again, policy probably needs to then sort of jump in and step in, which increases the demand on certain resources from the governments, for example, to try and deal with this over time.
And Sandy, from your perspective, oh, sorry, Jill, go first.
I was going to say, maybe to add to that, and when we looked at our scenarios, some of them widened that longevity gap. So, the socioeconomic differences that Maynard just mentioned. So some scenarios we saw widening longevity gap, highlighting the kind of growing inequality over time, whereas others narrowed the gap. I think maybe just focusing on the fact that liabilities tend to be concentrated in the most affluent individuals. So I guess understanding the impact for that group is likely to be most crucial for the audience of this call, which are likely to be working with pension funds and are also likely to be life insurers.
Sandy, can you sort of add to any sort of insight in terms of variations that you might be anticipating or think we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, those are really comprehensive. I think readiness, adaptation is interesting. And all these stuff is going to happen. Hotter, colder, wetter, food shocks, etc. And that kind of classic hazard exposure response vulnerability. Or we're just not really getting ready in Britain. And I think that's unfortunately likely to exacerbate the shocks, particularly for those lower socioeconomic groups. If you think about floods, for example, increased flood risk. So if the flood risk doubles from 0.1 to 0.2, well, that's something. If you have 100 communities, your risk is going from let's say 10% to at least 20%. So you're actually starting to get, which I think is a pattern we're seeing. Lots of kind of little and big floods everywhere, and it's that kind of indirect effects and cascading combined risk, more floods, more expensive insurance, cost living increases, both through insurance, possibly food inflation, where who pays for that, possibly insurance with withdrawal in some regions. Where does that budget come from? You start impacts on health, education, and services. I think the likelihood is the second order impact will unfortunately disproportionately impact those lower socioeconomic groups that are less capable of making the adjustments that Maynard talked to.
Yeah, it is really, really quite worrying in that respect. So we've talked about how to think about this. We've talked about some of the what to think about. Let's just sort of move on to sort of if people are sort of looking around of how to get started or how to sort of maintain their understanding. What sources of data of information should actuaries sort of see as the go-to to help them understand the current position and how things will change over time? Maynard, would you mind if I'm going first on that one?
Right. So I think there are a number of different sort of sources for some of these climate projections and in general sort of knowledge around climate. So I think my go-tos, if I'm sort of just looking to explore, have tended to be the World Bank is a climate change knowledge portal, which provides country level and in some cases state or provincial level sort of climate projections. And these include the common sort of shared socioeconomic pathways or SSPs that I think Jill sort of mentioned previously. So I think these can be a really good resource in you're looking at country level effects and just saying what might happen in the UK, what might happen in France, what might happen in Texas if you go to the States, for example. And it does provide a lot of different variables to think about, things like rainfall patterns, average temperatures, extreme temperatures, hot days, cold days. So you can start to get a bit of a sense of how things might vary from place to place. I think in the UK, the Met Office probably provides much more granular projections where you can sort of really target, like I want to see London area only, or I want to see a really small sort of 12 by 12 kilometer by 12 kilometer sort of square, and you start to have some of those more local impacts, and that can be useful if you're thinking about something that's much more local in nature that you're trying to. So the differences, say for example, between the north of Scotland and the south of England can be reasonably significant, and you might want to actually take that into account. But that just gives you largely the climate impacts. I think outside of that, there are various providers who, and including sort of KPMG, we've got our Climate IQ, where we try to sort of then expand the modeling in there to sort of start to bring in some of the economic modeling. So we're now moving beyond just the physical sort of climate risk into actually what happens with transition risk once you start to overlay how economies and sort of industries start to sort of respond to the climate risks and opportunities as they come along. So those are then sort of various areas where you might then start to expand, but I'll sort of start with maybe some of those more freely available. World Bank, Met Office can provide some really good information that can sort of get you started.
Cool. Jill, anything you'd add to that? other than anecdotal experience of the north of Scotland, perhaps?
I'll maybe stay clear of that. But yeah, I guess for me, the most obvious source of data, which Maynard's covered, is the recognised climate pathways. So, climate scientists, researchers, and regulators have laid out a wide spectrum of futures, and there are different ones for different use cases. So, Maynard mentioned the shared socioeconomic pathways. There's also the representative contribution pathways. They all provide a framework to aid thinking about what might happen in those pathways. And yeah, we've absolutely, or me personally, have made use of that material. I should say, I think as a longevity community, I think that we need to ensure that the work that we're doing as longevity actuaries can also then be used by others too. So I guess at Club Vita, we're hoping that by linking our scenarios to these recognised climate pathways as a sort of step in the right direction, allowing assets and liabilities to be considered in a joined up way, and hopefully by making these scenarios available to the public through our website, people then do have a practical, easy way to kind of get started, because I know it can be quite a daunting task.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I've got one final question before we sort of move on to any questions for the audience. I'm going to sort of pose this to Sandy in a minute. One of the things as longevity actuaries that we have a tendency to do is be sort of slightly biased by the term long, and that our modelling does tend to be smooth and gradual changes, and perhaps underestimate the pace and speed of change. So, Sandy, what are the sort of key tipping points that we should potentially make sure we're giving adequate consideration, which might cause significant disruption more sooner than we think?
All easy questions. I'm actually to an event next week with I think it will be research institute agencies, it's the government, UK version of the ARPA, and they're chucking 80 million at trying to get better early warning signals on tipping points. I guess that's your perspective. There is an observable trend with climate change of sooner than expected, worse than expected, and outside model projections. So that makes it, difficult, because we know that the models aren't capturing everything yet. But actually, from an actual perspective, that makes it easy, because we can just introduce a margin. So I think looking at global tipping points, Maynard's mentioned it, I've mentioned it quickly. I think that the tipping point which has the potential to impact the UK most significantly is the APOC. Lots of uncertainty. When does it tip? How does it tip? What could happen? And I think, Maynard, you talked this earlier, it doesn't need, Gulfstream doesn't need to completely switch off for our climate change very, very significantly. So that would not stop heat spikes in the summer, but it would very likely cause a Moscow-like climate in the winter, and also significantly reduce, I think, wheat and maize, Northern Hemisphere wheat and maize production by about 50%. So you're looking at multiple red basket failure. Now, if you look at what you would expect to see, or let's put it this way, if you look at the output from climate models of what would happen to the sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic, if the AMOC were to weaken, and you compare that with what is actually happening to sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic, they're identical. So, put it another way, this is starting to happen. The only spot on the planet which is cooling is the North So that's the one we should be most concerned about, because I think it's very, very, as we talked about, very challenging to be confident about what impacts would be. That obviously the heat, almost certainly food availability, security, box, text speeds, rest. Also, if you stop transporting all that heat out the tropics, you get kind of superheating in the tropics. How does that impact the UK for potential migratory flows, all that stuff? So really consequential, definitely one to think about. I would reiterate, I think as a species, we still have a lot of agency here, so that sort of thing doesn't happen. Anyway, AMOC, get into the AMOC, get your boards into the AMOC.
Thanks, Sandy. Okay, so just a reminder, if you've got any questions, put them in the chat. I'm going to move to this one. So the first one, I think, from Nikos, it hasn't been answered already. So climate change actuarial modelling has been around for at least 2 years. One would imagine working groups have been set up and discussions have been had on how to incorporate CC into various forms of modelling. Is the modelling uncertainty getting reduced at all, or is it becoming more taxonomy, but not reduced? Yeah, I like that word as usual. Is consensus being reached on any parts of climate change modelling for actuarial purposes? Brilliant questions there. Who would like to have a tackle of those, or any part of those? Are we reducing the uncertainty, or just reducing the uncertainty of the uncertainty?
I think it would be really quite difficult to reduce uncertainty this early. I think there's still a lot to learn. There's still a lot to understand and discover about what is likely to happen with climate change. So I think we're probably reducing uncertainty in the widest sense, but I don't think it will feel like that in the short term, because I think as you learn more, you start to understand what you might be underestimating more, and that will feel like more uncertainty as you go along. But I think in the long term, I think it will only be helpful for people to start moving down that direction. So yeah, I would say in the short term, it probably won't feel like uncertainty is reduced. But I think we can only ever improve our knowledge and improve what we understand about climate and the impacts on human health and human mortality, and on the wider sort of economy, and how that affects pension schemes, life insurance companies, liabilities, and everything over time.
Does that sound right to you as well, Jill?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's still way more that we can do here. It's a very short, 2 years is not a long time for this type of modelling. I guess there's the known unknowns, which we've probably been dealing with, as opposed to the unknown unknowns, which, how do we deal with those? Yeah, so there's always going to be uncertainty there.
Yes, and speaking for myself, if you don't start with a decent framework and a decent taxonomy, I'm just not happy. So I like that question. Question, I think I've spotted one, and this might be best to sort of go to Sandy, but please, other people, how has the global political resolve changed, if at all, since the Paris agreements?
Yeah, I mean it's bumpy, isn't it? So I think there are a couple of things. First, the US position is damaging to climate action, particularly in the United States. But the US has always blocked global climate action. So Kyoto, US blocked, and they have consistently interfered mostly with other petro-states. So what has changed is this sort of what I call it, kind of mendacious behind the scenes interference to overt levels of action. So that's clearly unhelpful for the world's largest company going backwards. But an increasing number of countries recognise renewables are just the cheapest way to get power. I mean, there's lots of fantastic data points for Pakistan, unreliable grid, expensive, lots of diesel generation. In 1 year, they imported enough rooftop solar from China for half their grid. So the pace and the scale of renewable tech output, mostly from China, is stunning, and the cost. So, although the political results were contested, the economics are becoming ever more clear. And while politics can delay a technology transition, it doesn't normally win in the long run.
So we're rapidly coming to the end of our time, even though I'm sure there's plenty of things that we'd like to discuss further, because this topic is going to dominate our attention. But a few plugs. I think it was mentioned earlier, the latest edition of the Longevity Bulletin has now been released and is focusing on this topic. That is not at all a coincidence. So hopefully you can sort of find some useful there. I think Jill and Sandy have both sort of posted some extra sources of insight in the chat. So take advantage of those if you can, although apparently I need to be a Ned. So that's another good reason to get promoted and stop doing any work. And I suppose I'm left with my thanks to Jill, Maynard and Sandy for sharing your time and your insight today. It's been a really interesting chat. And my thanks for you at home for joining and contributing in your questions. Goodbye until the next MRC webinar.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.